Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Interfaith Paths to Peace. This is our weekly Cultivating a Soul-Centric City program, and I want to welcome you to a really interesting panel conversation today on faith and fathering. As you may know, the Cultivating a Soul-Centric City is focusing on different life stages, and what do we need as a community to create a path and practitioners for integral human development from cradle to grave. This month, we've been looking at early childhood and that phase of life, and does Louisville have what it needs to nurture children? Next, in April, we'll be looking at children from 6 to 11 and talking with different organizational leaders of those in Louisville that are helping us create thriving environments for children, both looking at what we already have and what we need to cultivate. This conversation really arose out of a lunch that I had with Matt Kelly, who is on and is going to be one of our panelists. He has done some quite a bit of work in faith and fathering, or specifically in fathering, and has hosted a program with a group called Fathering Together, who is also co-sponsoring our event today. And I'll have Matt jump in a minute and introduce more about Fathering Together. And if you want to jump on their website, we'll include that both on Facebook Live and on our program in the chat box here today. So thanks everyone for joining us. This program I've really enjoyed the Soul-Centric City programming, and definitely know and appreciate and honor the fathers that we're going to have in the conversation today. So I want to thank them in advance. Let's jump right in. Thanks for joining us. And the first question that we've got for our panelists, I will introduce them by name, but have them introduce themselves a little bit more. The question is pretty a broad question. How has your faith background and current spiritual practices shaped how you approach being a father? So that's kind of the general question, and then we'll open it up to other questions from those that are joining us on Zoom. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you're welcome to put a question or a comment, and we'll try to bring that into our conversation as well. Thanks for joining us. I want to introduce Matt Kelly. Matt is been in Louisville. How long have you been here now, Matt? Like
about 4 years.
4 years. So Matt, thanks for our conversation at PF Chang's is what led to, hey, let's talk about faith and fathering. So Matt, tell us some more about Fathering Together and a little bit about your experience as a father as well.
Okay. Well, Judd, thanks so much for having me and having all of us today. Yeah, conversations over lettuce wraps lead to great things. So as Judd said, my name is Matt Kelly. I'm a United Methodist pastor. I've been here in Louisville area the last 4 years. My ministry has been primarily with the nonprofit community, where I work in making connections and doing resource development. I'm also very involved with a nonprofit called Fathering Together. It began a few years back simply as a Facebook page for dads with daughters. One of my dear friends from college and a few other people just cultivated this conversation, and it blew up real fast. So it was clear there's a hunger for community among people who identify as dads. It spun off into several other Facebook pages and is now a nonprofit called Fathering Together. Over 125,000 dads all over the world are engaged in our various programs and communities, not just in Facebook. We're actually developing a new behind a paywall community called Fatherhood Insider. I encourage you to go to the website fatheringtogether.org, or if you are on Facebook, go to either Dads with Daughters, Dads with Sons. The links are on there. We also, if you're here in Louisville, Kentucky, we do have a Louisville Dads by Fathering Together page where we cultivate the conversation locally, and I'm excited to continue this conversation here today. As I said, I'm a United Methodist minister. That is, I'm a cradle Methodist, baptized, born in that tradition. And so when I became a parent, I was already an ordained minister, very, very deep in the practice of the faith, but it really expanded my understanding of the core faith commitments of mine, which is that God has created all of us in God's image, that we are all precious in God's sight, and that we have to take very seriously how we treat each and every person, particularly those who are most vulnerable among us. whether that be as defined in some of the Old Testament prophets, the widow, the orphan, the stranger in one's land. And then when these tiny little vulnerable humans came into my life, some of the most vulnerable creatures of all, a human baby, and how is it that I not only treat them, which as their biological parent, of course, I'm going to do, but how is it that I then raise them and try to form them as human beings to share that commitment, whether they continue with my doctrinal commitment to a triune God, Jesus as the incarnation of God the Father, whether they do that or not. And with my 13-year-old, it's really up in the air right now with that one. But will they, confessional things aside, will they stay with those core commitments that I think transcend confessional identity? God has created all people in God's image. All people are of sacred worth, and the way we treat all people, particularly those to whom we are told we owe the least by the rest of the world, really show who we are as a human being, and really determines the significance of what we do in this life.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. I do want to say, and we talked about this some, Matt, that it's important that we're referring to father, not just those who are biological, but
Yes.
maybe fathering by marriage or adoptive or grandparents or uncles or anybody or siblings, people who feel like they father. So we're not trying to box that up just to biological. We're also very aware that different people who identify with different genders, cisgender, but also non-binary, and those in our LGBTQ community, they also father. And so we're not trying to just have a traditional view of fathering. I just want to state that at the beginning, and Fathering Together has done a really good job of coming out with that information. Matt, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, at Fathering Together, we've gone around a lot on this one. We do welcome anyone to the conversation that identifies as a father. We've stopped trying to put guardrails around it too much. I will also say I'm the parent of a gender nonconforming child. So I'm currently sitting with a lot of questions of gender identity, not just in the abstract, but in my own home. How do I understand that? How do I then understand myself as a cisgender identifying person? All those things. And then my wife and I, with father and mothering roles, we occupy some of the more traditional ones. Others we don't.
Yeah.
So that's an ongoing conversation in my own life and family. And yeah, everybody is welcome who identifies as a father. However you identify with that, you are welcome in this conversation. So thanks for clarifying that, Judd.
Yeah, no, thank you, Matt. I think that's really important that we open up that term and understanding of fathering to anybody who identifies with it. Farhan Abdi, I want to welcome you to the conversation. Farhan is just a dear friend, and he's got. I remember Farhan. It was I guess about 4 years ago when you had 2 daughters, and you invited me over for an iftar dinner in your home. And that was such a beautiful occasion. And Farhan is often on programming with Interfaith Paths to Peace. So Farhan, welcome to the conversation, and thanks for giving some time and thought to fathering.
All right, thank you, Jad. And I want to say, everybody, I hope you're feeling well. And my name is Farhan. I'm originally from Somalia, but I came to Louisville about 15 years ago. So this is my second home. And I'm involved with Masjid Bilal, which is a mosque, because my faith background is Muslim. So I'm part of the faith community, and also part of the faith activist that helps folks get advocate for the those who are underserved communities. But as a Muslim, we believe in worshiping one, and knowing God, who we call it in Arabic Allah. But the followers of Islam, is aimed to live a complete submission to God, and that's why everything I learn is through my faith and my father, what he taught me, and my mother, of course. But being a father to me is very, like, one of the top priority that I see a community needs a good fathers to move forward. I was telling my brother is everybody can be a father, but to be a father, you need to deserve to be a better every day. That's what I believe, and to encourage your kids and your children to be a better, but also being involved in this community, being involved with different cultures, different religions, also, shaped me to be a better father. And I was saying it's beautiful that you see people in different countries, different, religion, different backgrounds, still have the same hope that we all want our best for our children, and we all want to be a best fathers.
Thanks, Farhan. Thanks for introduction there. And we'll have some more questions specifically about the practice of Islam and what does it mean to be a Muslim and fathering. I do want to introduce David Lip as well, Cantor David Lip. Cantor Lip has been a big supporter of Interfaith Paths to Peace. And Cantor Lip, I miss all of our times together when you were leading, back during COVID, you were leading a weekly
Tuesday morning was my morning.
Yes, it was. And I miss you on Tuesday mornings. That was really a beautiful time. But thanks for joining us today, and introduce yourself a little bit more and some of the questions around faith and fathering for you.
Thank you, Judd. It's interesting. They say that you're never really from Louisville unless you went to high school here or graduated from high school here. And so, but I have to say, considering the great men that you've gathered here. I'm the oldest one here in terms of how long I've been here. I've been here 28 years. I was hired by Attitude Shurin 28 years ago, right out of seminary. It's kind of a good fluke for me and hopefully for them. They've decided to keep me around, so I suppose they like me okay. I'm only going to say what a cantor is because a lot of people ask me that, and they just, because what's a cantor? It's like, I think I know. They think they know what a rabbi is. They probably don't, but they think they know what a rabbi is. So just think of a rabbi who sings a lot. I'm not actually a rabbi. People call me rabbi sometimes. I'm not a rabbi, but I do a lot of teaching. A lot of the traditional Jewish service is sung. And so a cantor is somebody who ideally has mastered those aspects of singing, both for weekday prayers and for Sabbath prayers and for festival prayers and weekday prayers, and also for the many different kinds of chanting from scripture. In the same way that, that Farhan is aware of how one chants the Quran. There are different ways of chanting different parts of the Hebrew Bible, whether it's the 5 books of Moses, whether it's from the prophets, whether it's from various scrolls of the writings, etc. So just a short introduction of what a cantor is and does. So first of all, I have to say that Jewishly, there's a saying from the ancestors, and I'm saying ancestors, even though it says sayings of the fathers, because the truth of the matter is I'm assuming that most of these fathers got some of their wisdom from their mothers and from their wives, and they just were uncredited. So I'm just crediting them. It was 1800 years ago. Probably women still aren't being credited. I'm guessing they weren't credited 18 years. So from the wisdom of the ancestors, there's a series of questions, one of which is who is wise? And one who is wise is one who learns from everyone. And so I'm really honored to be with Farhan and with Matt and with you, Judd, to have you share your wisdom with me. And if you noticed, I have my pen and I'm taking notes because I always assume I can learn something. And part of what, as a father, I hope, and I hope I've done this with my daughter. I have one daughter, she's 26 years old, working on a PhD in counseling psychology. One of the things that I hope is that I have, that my religious tradition has led me to be a person who can be followed and who can be reasonably well imitated in terms of the better parts of who I am, while acknowledging the less better parts of who I am. Because the truth of the matter is, do as I say, not as I do, has not worked throughout the history of humankind. I don't believe it's going to start working just because that's how I want it to be. So hopefully, and at least from what I can tell, my daughter has learned some of the better parts of who I can be, and she's learned to leave aside the parts that I would rather, that she leave aside, but not because I told her not to, just because she figured out, well, maybe that's not what, the best way to be. And I'm pretty sure that every religion has a teaching that tells us this. So in Proverbs, which I know that I share with Matt, and my guess is also with Farhan to a certain extent, from Proverbs 22:6, it said, teach a child as she will go, or as he will go. Kedarko in Hebrew, which is understood again by the ancestors as every child has a different temperament. Some are more quick to anger. Some are less quick to anger. Some are more patient. Some are less patient. Some are more easily appeased. Some are less easily appeased. And this affects their learning styles. The rabbis also say they have different learning styles. Some people, some children and some adults, they take in stuff very quickly, but they lose it quickly. Some of them take it in quickly, but hold on to it. Some of them take it in slowly, but hold on to it. And each of these different learning styles requires a different way to impart whatever wisdom we have to impart. And I think every parent wonders whether they've kind of got that balance right. And I know this is the last question of the first, and I'll get to it more later, but, there's a part of me that always wonders, is like, was I too lenient here? Was I too strict there? And I think we're always going to question ourselves in terms of how we do that. But I would say that in Judaism, we're taught, among many things, that we're supposed to teach our children how to swim, okay, so that they'll be able to survive. God forbid they're on a ship and they fall over, they'll be able to swim to safety. So I interpret that, not only, I mean, we did teach her how to swim. I interpret that as you want to give them life skills so that they can take care of themselves, so that they're strong, so that they have the ability to take care of themselves as best they possibly can. And secondly, one is committed to teach their child a trade, so that they won't, and it actually says in the rabbinic sources, so they won't be thieves. Because if they don't have a trade, if they don't have an honest way to make a living, they'll find a dishonest way to make a living. And so for many of us, not for all, but for many of us, that means make sure that you provide them with the ability to get a decent education so that they can work for a living. So I would say that from my perspective, just kind of answering the first question, my sense is how the tradition teaches me to teach. And even more importantly, when my daughter was first born, one of the rabbis who officiated at my wife and Mai's wedding, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who you may have heard of, he's written a few books, he left a voice message for us. And I think it was actually on an answering machine. This was like a long time ago. She's 26, remember? And it was a beautiful prayer. And this is what he said. He said, "May your daughter be a patient teacher." And I have to say, considering how clueless at least her dad boomer can be, I think she's been very patient, and I hope she continues to be. So again, thank you for inviting me to participate in this, and I look forward to learning with you all.
Great, thank you, Cantor Lip. Appreciate those words. So I'm kind of on this panel, kind of not. I was ordained a Protestant Presbyterian and became kind of an interfaith. What I call myself is a sacred humanist. So I don't necessarily practice any one tradition, and so I'll try to reflect a little bit out of humanism as my tradition. The one thing that I hope that my kind of training in sacred humanism has brought to my parenting, and ultimately the Christian tradition that I was raised in, is a sense that ultimately I hope I can reflect unconditional belonging to my children, that there's nothing they can do to be outside of my complete love and belonging. Not that I just love them, but they know they will always belong to me. They will always belong to our family, to our ancestors, and there's nothing they can do. I mean, there may be things I don't like or wish or hope for them, but it doesn't matter. There's nothing they can do that they will not belong to me. And ultimately, I think psychologically, that sense that we get from God, that we are God's children and there's nothing we can do. I mean, there may be things that are outside of what God would hope for us or God created us to be, that we may be and become, but that doesn't matter. We're still always included, that unconditional sense of love. And I know that from child psychology, which is the humanism piece of science, that is an essential category for all of us, or especially for human development at the beginning, that they know they belong, and they will always belong no matter what they do. There's a concept in what's called family systems, some work from Bert Hellinger that says the most important thing is that a child always knows they belong. both to a family or to a community. And that psychologically is so important. So that's my little piece from my tradition or traditions. The second question gets a little bit further into this, and the question is, what is one of the most important aspects of your faith practice or your faith tradition that you want to instill in your children, whether or not they, ultimately follow you along doctrinally or identify the same tradition? Is there something from your tradition that you really hope they take from you? Farhan, I'm going to jump in and start with you on this one, and then we'll go David and then Matt. Farhan, is there something from you?
Yes, Jada, thank you. So one thing I want to say is that, Islam gives a great importance, to fathers, because it says that, it encourages men to become a good fathers to their children. So I know that when I was young, and I knew when I become a father, I would be one of the best I could. Also, since God put us in a high rank when it comes to family, and to lead the family, protect and protect and knowledge, but we also, I believe, we are the encouragement force for the family. Father has to be like it's like the one who will always showing, protecting with encouragement for them to do good. But for me, in my culture, what thing is, a father has to be the provider, and also to be very close relationship with all of his children. Like there's no, you have to be equal to all your children, be equality. And they know when they want to talk to someone that you will be equal no matter what. And my father was always, one thing he teach me was, me and my sisters were all equal to him. He did not like my sisters more than my brothers. So we knew that. And that's one thing I want my kids to take it. Always be fair to each and every one.
Thanks, Farhan. David, how about you? Anything from your tradition that you hope your children take?
So again, I just have one daughter, as far as I know. So to the best of my knowledge.
And there's a picture of her on your desk there, which is
there
lovely.
is right there.
Yeah,
that's right. Yes. Eating a huge piece of pizza. It's a piece of pizza almost as big as her head, because she's relatively small. I'm gonna put in two here. There's an old saying that Jews are like everybody else, only more so. So I apologize. I'll do them quickly. So one of them is, one of the aspects of our tradition. I know it's not unique to our tradition, but I've often thought that one of the reasons that we say a blessing before we eat something, regardless of what we eat, not just as I see in many Christian homes where where they say a beautiful blessing before eating a communal meal. I think that's a gorgeous thing. Traditionally, Jews, whenever we eat something, if we're alone, if we're together, whatever it is, we say a blessing for any kind of food that we're going to eat before a meal. And my feeling about it, especially on the Sabbath, when they're a little bit longer and the food is just ideal a little bit better, is it's kind of an enforced lesson on delayed gratification, right? You have a child, a 3-year-old, who comes up to the lectern, to say a blessing before drinking some really great sweet grape juice. And when you're 3 years old, grape juice is a big deal, especially the first few times. And to have to wait for that minute, that's like an eternity to a 3-year-old when there's something sweet in front of them. And I think to a certain extent, whether my daughter chooses to say all the blessings the way I do, which is unlikely, I understand, but whether she does or not, the fact that she may have picked up this idea of delayed gratification as a child and applied it to other aspects of her life is something that is a life lesson that I think Judaism and I think many other religions can teach in a very beautiful way. And my second one is, for us, and at least for the way that I celebrate my religion, Hebrew is essential. It's part of our prayer. It's the original language of the Bible. And yes, you can read anything in translation, but somebody once said that reading the Bible in translation is like kissing the bride through a veil. It's always going to kind of miss something in translation. And so when my daughter was very young, we decided my wife would speak to her in English and I would speak to her in Hebrew. And she kind of started rebelling against this by the time she was 3, because she realized everybody else in the world was speaking English and only her dad was speaking this weird language that she understood. But eventually she said, I don't want to talk this anymore. I just want to speak in English. But then when she was a teenager, she said, Dad, could you start talking to me in Hebrew again a little bit, So it was something that did stay with her. And when she took her gap year in Israel, even though she was not a fluent speaker, with everybody else who was around, she was always put forward as the translator because she understood almost everything. And I think that is something, I mean, I've always said that if I was ever president, I would put in a decree, right? Like a presidential decree that said, everybody in this country needs to know 2 languages. One of them has to be English. It could be any other language in the world, because the truth of the matter is we need to be able to understand different people. And the only way to really understand different people, or to at least begin to, is to speak their language, literally and figuratively. So at least for us, religiously speaking, for my daughter, and I'd love for her to know 6 other languages too, but for her to know Hebrew, I felt was a very important piece of my religious tradition that I wanted to hand off to her.
That's beautiful. I love, thank you. I love the way you took the liturgy and then applied that to delayed gratification. If she's in a PhD program, I think she's learned the idea of delayed gratification. So I think you've done well on that one.
Oh, yes.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Matt, how about you?
Gosh, I resonate so much with what my colleagues have said here. I will say, for my own tradition of Christianity, one of the most compelling things to me in the story of Jesus is in so much of his ministry was simply being present with people. There are certainly long sections of teaching and things like that, but much of Jesus' ministry is healing, touching others, hanging out, having dinners, drinking wine with people. And in Paul's epistles, one of them talks about Christ, the incarnate second person of the Trinity, who exists before even the person of Jesus of Nazareth, did not regard equality with God as something to be held to that person's self, but to be emptied and to come down and to be present. And for me, growing up in a fairly privileged suburban background, oftentimes we were taught in the church, mission and mercy and things like that were these kind of mission tourism things where you fly halfway across the world to help build a house or a school or something, which is great, but rarely ever take notice of persons experiencing homelessness in your own community. How many of us, when I was going to school, knew the name of the janitors who were cleaning our classrooms, things of that nature. And the story of Jesus, both in the narratives of the Gospels and in the ways it is proclaimed doctrinally in the epistles and other things, speaks of the necessity of being present with all of God's children, not simply to stand on the other side of a line in a soup kitchen, although that is necessary for people to have the meals and the means to survive, but to be in relationship with people, whether it be, your neighbor who is next door to you, who is struggling in lots of ways, the person experiencing homelessness downtown, and everything in between, to say we are going to not simply focus on ideas or even necessarily certain actions, although those are great, but simply to build relationships and to be present with one another in many ways, like Jesus did in the Gospels.
Thanks, Matt. If I were to think about, there's 2 things. So I'm gonna do 2 as well, David, to join you in my more than. The things that came to mind, the first is the central importance of community. And I think in the midst of a very individualistic culture where, it's about me and my spiritual practice or my, whatever, that is what I miss the most about being grounded in a community. When my children were young, I was a pastor of Covenant Community Church, and the centralness of community was really important. And I love the phrase, I'm not sure who came up with it, that the next, maybe in Thich Nhat Hanh, but the next Buddha or the next Christ will not be an individual, but a community. And so this idea that we we have a greater reflection of who God is in community than we do just by our own religious experience. So that it's when we're in community that we more fully reflect the fullness of the divine than it is when we're alone. So it's not just our individual experiences, it's our life in community that we reflect the fullness of the divine. The second piece is in Presbyterian liturgy, which is just our order of service. We always do this thing called the passing of peace, or it's a reconciliation or prayers of confession and awareness. What I so miss about all of the liturgy that we did as Presbyterians, which was pretty ordered, in all the services you do all kind of basically the same things, the same pattern. But I miss passing of the peace, because it was that one moment, not only with people I was in community with, but with my family, that I got to drop into awareness that I have been less than who I want to be for them. And it gave our family a time to just say, or to think about, how have I hurt my other family members? Or how have I hurt my community? And then to have the chance to pass the peace, to say, I am sorry. I realize what I've done and I want to do better. And that passing of the peace as a congregation, we were really huggy. So we would all pass the peace and give each other a hug, or you shake hands. But just when I would come along to my kids or my spouse and pass the peace with them. And otherwise, now we don't have an opportunity to do that, to say, I've hurt you. I need forgiveness. And can we reconcile? I miss that piece in our culture and in my family. So that piece is really, how do we pass the peace with each other? How do we name how we've been less than for each other? So I would say that that's a piece from my Presbyterian tradition. So another question is, how has the experience of being a parent affected your concept of the divine or the transcendent? So being a parent, how has that affected maybe the way you've related to God or understood God? And Matt, I'm going to start with you and then go Farhan and then David. But Matt, how has that affected you?
So I know for me growing up, particularly in the American South, when evangelicalism sort of entered a new era married to political activism, and I grew up with parents who had been part of very what they had called very hardcore churches growing up, focusing on sin, on our guilt before God, God's wrath and anger. My parents would have, if they ever read Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, they'd say, I heard that every Sunday growing up. They kind of rejected that. And so I grew up very much with the idea of God as loving, of kind. And as I got older and started reading people like Brennan Manning and others who really embodied God's radical grace, I had a hard time reconciling the idea, which is very much there in the text of the scriptures of not only the Jewish and Christian faiths, but many others, of the divine is not too happy with the many ways humanity is messed up. And so I had a very hard time reconciling the idea that God could be angry with me for all the ways I mess up, and be loving and gentle and fully giving of God's self, again, as is expressed in Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. That always had a hard time kind of holding those in tension. Then I became a parent, and I realized that I love this other person so completely that when they're doing things that could harm themselves or others, it makes me so ridiculously mad because I love them. And so I've realized I can simultaneously want to wring that kid's neck and be willing to jump in front of a bullet for them. And those things are not contradictory at all. You hold all of those things together. And I've come to believe that's why the metaphor of God as parent and the concepts of both mothering and fathering, gender binaries being problematic the way they are, they're there in scripture, both God as father and mother, I believe the concept of God as parent, there's a reason that that is one of the most frequent metaphors for God in sacred text, because that relationship gives us a glimpse into the depth and the intensity of emotions that all exist at the same time. When we are viewing our offspring, those we have created, we are created by God and God's children, and the intensity to which God feels those things about us is magnified so much. But that's my own little glimpse into the way God feels about me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for parsing the gender dynamics there in that. Farhan, how about you? How has your faith or experience of being a parent affected your understanding of God and the divine?
Yes, Jad. I mean, for me, I will say as I grow, anyway, I'm a father of 3 children. So for the last 10 years, I will say last 7 years, I've been a father. I understand that the best thing a human being can learn is through experience. And as I'm growing, I'm learning that life is about experience and learning and learn from it and forward. So as I know in my book, and my prophet, peace be upon him, Muhammad, say that the best of you is the one who is best to his family. That's the best in this world. And knowing that is some people, they can be best on outside, but when they come to the family, they won't be the best. But that's where you're supposed to start. As you said, being a father, a prophet says that a father educating his children is better than even a charity. Giving a charity is better than even, teaching your children and encourage them to do good. So this one helped me because as I grow, I have a vision now. I have a responsibility that God gave me that he didn't give to other ones. Some people can have children, but that's God. We believe God decides who he will make a father. So when you get that opportunity, it's a gift and, leverage that some people don't have it. So it defined me to be a better person every year, to set up a role for them, to set up a good role model for my children and teach them, what a good father is. So that belief and define helped me that wherever I am today is because I know I have, daughters. The daughters, they say their first love is their father. So I'm teaching them as what God is telling me through that and giving them experience. So I think the more I grow up, that's why I encourage even young men to marry early so that they learn through life. So I'm 30 now and I learn a lot through my experience. So it's easier for the next coming years.
Thanks, Farhan. There's some questions or things that are coming up for me that we can get to, but I want to give everybody a chance to answer these first. David, how about you?
So in terms of my kind of concept of God, I mean, there are often those who kind of set up this, speaking of non-binary, I have a very non-binary notion of what God is. And that's not only a sexual statement, although it's partly, to the extent that we're made in the image of God. The fact is that there are those of us who are made in an image that's not cisgender. So to that extent, yes, I'm saying God is non-binary. But I guess I mean it in a different way as well. God is non-binary in the sense that I think there are many of us who choose to see God or to understand God as the transcendent mystery of the universe, the mystery of the cosmos, not to be understood, and at the same time, or the immanent God, the God that I think we've been talking about, the God of love and the God of relationship and the God of community and all those wonderful things that all of you have spoken about so articulately. And of course, I don't think I'm the only one to say that Jewishly, when those kinds of binary, when those kind of binaries oppose, like, is God immanent or is God transcendent? The answer is generally yes. So in terms of how my kind of concept of the areas of experience that I've allowed for God to influence me due to the fact that I had a daughter, I guess just and it's going to sound cliche, but really just the miracle of birth for those who have not experienced what that's like, and to hear your child first cry when they come into the world and to get to hold them. There's no experience like that. And I would say that I mean, I suppose if you're a confirmed atheist, you can say that there's nothing particularly transcendent about it, and I respect that. But at least for me, that certainly expanded my experience. I believed it existed. Intellectually, I knew that there was such a thing as that miracle, but to actually experience it for oneself is something that is I mean, it's hard to describe in words. I'm having a hard time, and I think all of us who have had children, boys or girls, or or everything in between, can relate to that. And I would say, secondly, that the experience of raising a child, and as a child responds to the world in, with these first eyes, with these first experiences, and sees things in a very kind of raw and unfiltered way, that they haven't learned all those layers that we have in order to live in the world. There's something about being able to see the world that way that to me connects, again, us being in God's image, that aspect of God that is able to strip away the filters to be able to see the truths of reality in a fresh way. I think that's a gift that most of our children give us. And at least for me, that has kind of helped expand how I choose to understand what God is and what God can be. For us, for Jews, for Jewish people reading the Bible, the kind of seminal experience of God is Moses at the burning bush, right? And Moses says, "What's your name?" And so God says, "Well, I am the God of your ancestors, right? But also I will be what I will be," which to my understanding is, you will never completely understand me. There will always be depths and expanses and internal expanses of which I am part of experience that you will never completely understand. You can never get a hold of me completely, but at least for me, the way I choose to read it, there are always opportunities for experience of what God is and the reality of God's world that God has given. And to be able to see and experience the world through my relationship with my child is something that I think expands my divine awareness, let's say, in a way that pretty much nothing else has.
Yeah, thank you. What a good insight into the relationship between our personal experiences and the divine. The two things that I would add to the conversation, I grew up with a father that was very nurturing and very emotionally present to me. So I've heard people struggle, they associate God with, wrath or order, or, kind of these historically traditional ideas around masculinity. I didn't grow up with that. In fact, my mother was a little more ordering in my life. She created order for the family. And I think for me, which I think maybe times we associate with masculinity, but my father was very emotionally present. So I never had that wasn't hard for me to understand as a child, God as nurturing father. So I was pretty non-binary in my understanding as well, and non-gender specific roles in my family were very much shared. So all of those images for God were appropriate and helpful for me. What ended up happening for me, though, and this is one of the reasons I moved out of being a Christian, is I no longer had a concept of God as being personal or having personal characteristics. So, and they call that theism or supernatural theism, these theological views that God is like a person in some way. And when I became a kind of a Buddhist, or in my philosophy of Buddhism, I did away with kind of these personifications of God. So even the concept of parent or father or mother in some ways became limiting for me, because I experienced God as not having those kinds of ways in which God interacted with the world. And so that was one of my breaks, actually, from I was trying to figure out what a non-theistic Christianity looked like that didn't understand God as being like a person or supernatural theism. I know that gets a little theologically complex or whatever, but that was important in my concepts of the divine and becoming more of a sacred humanist. So those are kind of the questions that we had for each other. And I want to kind of open it up to anyone else that's on the Zoom call that maybe have a question, or also open it up with those that are panelists to be able to have some conversation with each other. Anything coming up for you all, or Matt, I may actually turn to you. Is there any other kind of questions or insights? You've had a lot of these kind of conversations before. Is there anything that you would like to add into the space?
Gosh, there's been lots of good stuff that has come up. I know for me, in my interactions with people of other faiths and other traditions, seeing so much, again, being raised in a fairly homogenous Christian environment. I was not raised in my own home with a sort of Christian supremacy, but there was a lot of it around me growing up. Oh, well, without Jesus, you don't have morals. I never really bought into that, but there was a lot of that around me. But then as I got older and interacted with people of other faiths, and then particularly I was in college when 9/11 happened, and people were really starting to ask very deep questions about religion, and the interaction with the way one comes into the world. And I often experienced people who were not confessionally Christian as more moral people. A lot of the Christians I knew. So that started to peel back layers for me of saying, well, just confessionally, what is it that makes one a good person? Or is it something deeper? Is it something beyond that? So I know for me in my own practice of fathering, trying to say to my kids, well, this is where we come from. These are the stories that have been foundational to us, to your mother and I in our own tradition, many in our community, but there is something broader in all of humanity, and to make sure that they try to form relationships early on with people of other traditions or don't espouse any particular tradition, to say that there is something that transcends confessional identity that makes people, good people, however one identifies that. So to turn that into a question, I'm curious to others, just how is, for all of us, interaction with people of different faiths, how has that shaped us in the way we view God, and then the way that we've then tried to impart those ideas to our own children? I know that's a huge word salad there, but I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. And let's just, at this point, I'll just open it up to anybody, including those that are on Zoom that haven't been part of our panel. If you want to unmute and join the conversation, either in answering that or have other, Farhan or David, anything come for you all with Matt's question or anything else?
I want to add to this is that me as a Muslim and coming from another background, I was not raised in the US, but one of the challenges I always think about is because it says that how are you going to raise your children when you were raised different? Like the way I was raised was way different than the time we are right now. So one thing I always say is, so that difference itself is a challenge. Like I was raised in a village where everybody was raising me, while you're in another side of the country where it's you and your kids, your parents and the kids. Not everybody else. People are busy, life. So that's also one thing I always ask myself, and it's a challenging. And I think it is time and learning from others. That's why I was interested in this panel and learn from other people in this panel.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Farhan. I think, and that's why we're trying to expand that concept of fathering. And I know on the program today, we've got a lot of people that are, biological fathers, but that important role of community to father, however we might decide, and I think, the traditional family structure, we also take, that's pretty Western and often white, that, there are these two parents living in the home, and that fathering is often done by multiple generations, and uncles, and, that role really is expanded. So thanks, Farhan, for, I think bringing in that conversation and appreciation of all the people who father and the different ways in which they do that. David, did you have something that was coming up for you?
So I had to leave for a second, so I'm not sure I got the entire question, but let me try. And if I miss it, then you can re-ask me. My sense of how at least my religious tradition works in terms of fathering, and I just have to agree with you, Farhan. I think, and just to kind of stand on the shoulders of what both you and Judd said, I think that in most of the world, and even throughout most of history, parenting has been a village activity. It has not been the nuclear family. Nuclear family is primarily an American construct from the 1950s that we've latched onto as if it's been around forever. So I really appreciate that perspective. And I think that the more that our communities can become part of the fathering and the mothering and the parenting, the better our children, the better our society will be. So, I'm glad you said that, because it was not something that was in my notes, but it's certainly, it's certainly true. I guess when it comes to kind of the, where ethics comes out of practice, from my perspective, ideally, the way it's supposed to work, it doesn't always, but ideally, Jewish practice, even ritual practice, is supposed to have an ethical outcome, is supposed to have an ethical flowering. And it doesn't always. Certainly, a person can be completely ritually pious and cheat in business. People can do that. But the ritual is set up in such a way in order to encourage and to inspire good behavior and so forth. So my hope is that by creating a traditional Jewish home, that I have given my daughter a grounding from which to create an ethical life, whatever particular rituals she chooses to take with her, or to transform in ways that are meaningful to her and to future generations. And it's interesting, I spoke to her last night telling her I was going to be on this panel, and she brought up something that really kind of helped me in this area. She said, on Shabbat, in a traditional household, in our traditional household, we tried to have dinner together every night, even on weeknights. But on the Sabbath, almost always we had dinner together, and there were no screens. Okay, we wouldn't get on our phones, we wouldn't get on our computers, and so what that allowed for was a lot of extra time to talk and joke about the week. And ultimately, as my daughter got older, sometimes, my wife tended to be an earlier to bed person than myself. I'm more of a night person. We would stay up and we'd have these really long and deep conversations. And I was reminded of a Jewish thinker, his name is Dennis Prager, who said, there's no such thing as quality time. That's something that American, parents like to say, oh, I gave, a quality 7 minutes to my kids. It's like, there's no such thing as quality time without quantity time. If you don't give your kids the quantity time, you have to have time to just hang out together, so that those kind of ideas and thoughts and issues that you can't schedule your kids to come up with what's important to say at that very minute. You can schedule a lot of time to have a good food, good conversation, joke around, talk about your week, and then all of a sudden something that will come up that will lead to a deeper conversation. It'll get into the history of your family and where you came from, and why you are the way you are, and why Aunt X is the way she is, and why Uncle Y is the way he is, etc. And these are conversations that don't come out of nowhere. And I think that, and again, I think every religion has rituals which create that space of time for both families and community to be together, so that these kinds of improvisational conversations can happen that allow for us to go much deeper and kind of much more meaningfully into our relationships, where we can both be guides and learn from that kind of first sight that our children develop as they grow and mature.
Thanks, David. Anything else coming up for anyone that you want to jump in and just share? I think, David, one of the things that came up for me when you were sharing is the importance of religious imagination in children. I mean, this is kind of my scientific, how children use images in order to deal with anxieties. And so I think a rich religious imagination, which telling our children these stories over and over and over, singing them, and then we used to do this thing called Sacred Space, where we invite the children to come down. It's kind of like the children's message. And we would use these little figures to tell these stories. It's just the storytelling of Jesus doing this, or, the Hebrew texts of, Moses crossing. But these stories and the images they evoke for them then become the way that scientists tell us, psychologists tell us, they then use these stories in making meaning out of their lives. So it's not that they just take this is what the story means. They actually take the narrative of the story and then reimagine that when they come into their own situations. A lot of times, they talk about children that were raised in faith communities are able to deal with anxiety better because they have a concept of a loving, caring, God that's been present with them through these different times. And I think that's really important. And I think one of the things we lose when you move outside into secular world or families that are not children that are not part of religious communities is, where's the religious imagination in our culture? Because then you'll take narratives from where? From TV or from TikTok. Do those narratives have the quality to help people deal with existential questions? And I think no, in some ways, they really don't have the narrative capacity, the rich religious imagination to help them cope with what does it mean to be human. So that's what got brought up for me. Matt?
Judd, what you're saying makes me think a lot about particularly the power of storytelling. That again is something that really just reaches across different traditions. My 10-year-old can tell you in great detail the story of when she was 18 months old, and I was doing a wedding rehearsal in the church I was pastoring at the time. My wife was taking pictures. She and her older sister were chasing each other around, and she tripped and fell into the corner of a pew and has a nice little 1-inch gash in her forehead. And we had to go to the emergency room and all that. Well, she was 18 months old, and it somehow came up. I think she was telling one of her friends about it. And recently I said, Claire, do you actually remember any of this? No. But she can tell the story in such great detail that it's part of her. That scar is physically part of her. But in terms of, she has just heard that so much over and over that even if she doesn't have a conscious memory, that is part of her. My oldest daughter, Kate, the story of her birth included some things that were really profound, and I've actually wrote about that in a book that I contributed to, and she knows a lot of those details. Of course, she has no conscious memory being born. And so they would not relate this to any scriptural text, but it makes me think of when in Deuteronomy Moses is talking about, over and over again, remember when you were slaves in Egypt. And I didn't realize this until seminary. A professor pointed it out to me that, all the people he's talking to, save for Caleb and Joshua and himself, have no conscious memory of being slaves in Egypt. All those folks died out in the 40 years in the wilderness. It's like, wait, well, they weren't. They were born in the wilderness. Why are you saying you? I mean, it's a much larger you across the generations, but they're so fully formed in these stories that it is a part of them. So even if they don't have a conscious memory of being in Egypt and building the palaces and the whole bit there, that is a big part of how we pass on not just the story itself, but a larger meaning of who we are. Claire can tell you that story about running into the pew, but also how the only time she cried during that was when her mother looked over at her and saw the blood running down her face and screamed, and then she started crying. She knows something about the deep the deep identification that family members have with one another's pain through that. Again, she wouldn't, at this point at least, reach that back into the biblical text. But there's something about her with the stories that have been passed down, not just the incident itself, but a grander meaning about the nature of our relationships that she knows because she's heard those things over and over.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah. Farhan, David, what's coming up for you all? Or anyone else again on the Zoom calls, welcome to join in as you feel comfortable.
I'm not sure if you kind of got to what the greatest challenges are. I mean, is that part of what we're talking about now? Is that?
No, that was a question. Thanks. The question there was, yeah, how is your faith? Let's see, how do I describe it? Describe a major challenge you have faced as a parent and how your faith or spirituality helped you to navigate it. So yeah, thanks. That's kind of the official question.
So as I think I alluded to earlier, I guess, one of the kind of mystical notions of what God's about, and which tries to kind of harmonize this classical notion of God being omniscient and omnipotent and good at the same time, which of course leaves the whole problem of evil and free will and so forth. And people have written, tomes about these questions and how to deal with them. And our mystical tradition gives us a really fascinating concept, and my guess is it exists in other traditions as well. But it's the idea that God is all those things, and yet, as we as humankind mature, God intentionally contracts God's self. In other words, God contracts God's power, God's omnipotence, perhaps even God's omniscience, and allows for human beings to have free will. After all, we're made in God's image, so presumably if God has free will, God's going to give us that ability, and that's kind of how it happens. And I guess to the extent that I choose to view God in the metaphor as a parent and as a father, at least as part of that, that parental unit, I think there's always going to be a part of me that wonders whether I was too lenient or too strict, or in this case or that. The other aspect, and it's something that I believe pretty strongly, and my guess is again many other religions do as well. I've sometimes heard parents say, well, we're not going to give our kids any kind of religion, we're just going to let them decide. And I have a pretty strong feeling, not only because of who I am, and I have a pretty strong feeling about my own religion, but I think that children need some imposition of identity in order to feel comfortable in their skin and just knowing who they are. And this is my pretty strong opinion. However, at some point, as they're growing up, you have to start doing that tzimtzum. You have to start contracting yourself, because to most of our kids, we are gods to them, until they get older and see that we're flawed human beings like they are. And that's always a pretty, difficult moment for most of our kids to realize that. I think it was difficult for us when we realized that our parents weren't divine, and they had their own flaws as well. And so knowing kind of how much to pull back and when and how is a very hard thing. Maybe it's easy for some people, but I can tell you, for me, just having one daughter, it was hard to know. Did I back off too soon? Should I have been a little bit more involved here? Should I have been a little bit less involved here? And that's I would say that really until she was out of the house, that and perhaps even now to a certain extent, that's a question that I'll always live with. And my guess is that most thoughtful fathers will think about it. I guess some will just kind of go by by their gut, and if they have really good guts, that's great. But I think it's at least for me, that's a constant struggle.
Thank you. What else is coming up for us? Anything that you want to echo? Farhan, did you have something?
No, I just want to echo what David said. Is as we know, in Islam, we believe that Allah, has commanded a father, to work hard, provide physical, educational, psychological, and spiritual need of a child. There's things that we believe in my religion, and I agree. What David said is the children. We said every child was born innocent, parents, born in what, but we choose as a father and parents to give that child the need, not only because most of the fathers nowadays, especially in my community, believe that feed the children, take care of the roof, take them to school, and that's it. And the rest they're gonna figure out. No, is you have to provide that need until they reach the age of adolescent. We say until they are 18. After they're 18, God takes, in my religion, God takes that responsibility from you. That once they reach that adulthood, you're no longer responsible. But when they're young, it's your responsibility to feed, the need and the faith and all that things.
One of the things, so I have 3 kids. They were all raised in a Presbyterian church that I was co-pastoring at the time, and so they were deeply involved. They've all chosen to not practice and wouldn't identify as I'm not exactly sure how they would identify at this point. But I think I'll just speak personally. One of the things I long for, and now that I'm not practicing in a tradition, is intergenerational community. I found that church provided intergenerational opportunities for my kids to know people that were older and younger. And I'm so, I don't have interactions, weekly, monthly interactions with a lot of intergenerational community. And I think that's one of the things that religion provides that I wasn't aware of, that a religious community provided, is intergenerational connection. And I just don't have that right now. And I'm kind of longing for that. The other piece that I'm very aware of is the lack of ritual in my life or rites of passage. How do I mark what's going on in my life? And a religious community allowed me to do that, with my children, with, baptisms and blessings and confirmation process. And so where do I go for kind of a ritualistic, intergenerational ritual life, which in a secular world, I just don't find, I find it lacking there. So I'm aware of some of my own need, but also some concern about, what will my children choose to do if they have children, or if they adopt children, or however, where will they find those things that are really important to me? So we can begin to, I guess I want to begin to close down the conversation. This has been so rich, and it's one of those conversations I think we could continue, and I really appreciate the different cultural, religious perspectives. Would like to give a chance for us to kind of summarize, and I'll just start again with Matt, and then Farhan, and then David, if you want to do kind of a checkout comment about what's come up for you in the conversation, what's been insightful and important to you, and any kind of final words you want to say. So Matt, would you begin our checkout?
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about conversations like this is across our differences, how we hear so many echoes of our own stories from others, and we see how much we have in common. And at the same time, we see how very real and rich our differences are, and they challenge us in some very real ways, whether it be living in a different culture than where we grew up, living in a city where we're not really one of them unless we've gone to high school here. Trying to go to high school here. My wife did. So I guess that makes me grandfathered in, if you will. But that both challenges and nurtures us in a lot of ways, that I sometimes, in fact, often learn more from being around the table, whether it be physically or virtually, as we are here with people who have come from different places than I am, than I do when it's a homogenous group around the table who grew up like me, have a lot of the same beliefs. We end up doing a lot of navel gazing, and sometimes assuming, we're like the right way to be. I get challenged around these tables and comforted at the same time, which is wonderful. So I thank all of you for being here today.
Beautiful. Challenge and comfort. What a beautiful polarity. Farhan, how about you check out? Thanks again for giving some time today, Farhan.
Oh, no problem, Jad. I'm always, enjoy all your, conversations and events. So always put me in place. So I like it. And one thing I want to say is checkout it's amazing. I'm always want to learn, as David says. I always got my notebook. It's I'm assuming every time I meet people, I learn something new, and this is beauty of human being. So for me, I see, as what Matt says, there's a lot of echo and similarity, on human beings. But also, my checkout will be, everyone needs a system in place, human beings. You can't just run. Like when I was coming to the US 15 years ago, and someone who comes last year, they go through the same system if they came through the process I came through. Like you get your social, you get your green card, you get your work permit. And the system was in place for a while. And I believe human beings need a system. Like I have children, I'm building them to have a system, which is the book of the Quran we believe in. It tells you what you need to do daily, what needs to be done. So that system is what keeps me stronger, and I feel like I'm in the right path because you have a system that you can look into and see if you are messing up or not. But that's all my checkout, and it was great to meet all of you.
Thank you, Farhan. Thanks for being here. And David, you get the final word. Good to have you.
Oh,
Thanks for giving some
I
time.
think you're going to
today.
get the final word, but I'll
that's probably
give
true.
the
Yeah.
penultimate final word. So, as Farhan said, I mean, I have been taking notes, and I've really appreciated learning from all of you dads today. From Farhan, just kind of this emphasis on community, and I'm kind of I don't know. I guess it happens every 11 or so years, but this is one of those years where Ramadan and Easter and Passover happen kind of in the same month. Yeah, I mean, Easter and Passover always happen pretty much in the same month, but the fact that Ramadan actually, that you'll be having an iftar late at night while I'm having a Seder, I just think is a lovely thing. And I'm excited for that, for that confluence. But again, your emphasis of community and growing up with a village and wanting to, I'm assuming wanting to bring that from your community also here, where we're kind of Americans and we're very much in this nuclear family kind of idolatry, is something that you teach us all, and I really appreciated that. Matt, I had no idea about your website, and I'm really, I'm excited about it, but I think more kind of intentionally, I think that the way you articulated this idea that sometimes, and this is especially when they're teenagers, it's like at the same time you want to wring their neck and you want to take a bullet for them at the same time, and those are not contradictory. I mean, I really loved that. I just, trust me, I'm going to use it, but I'll try to make sure that I quote it accurately every time.
Oh, nothing new under the sun. So
going back to Ecclesiastes, and then
exactly,
Judd, I remember what you brought up for me when you were talking about unconditional belonging. I love that term. I mean, I don't know if you made it up or not. I love it. And it reminded me, and you sort of said this yourself, my dad was incredibly profane. He was not religious at all. He was proudly Jewish, but I know a lot of religions don't understand, secular atheist Jews, but he pretty much was. And of course, I adored him, in his own kind of, idiosyncratic way. But he used to say to us, to his kids, he used to say, I love you, and there's not and he would use the G word, there's not a G damn thing you can do about it. And he said it, and he'd say it with a huge twinkle in his eye. And when you talked about unconditional belonging, it brought those memories back to me, because he would say that to me often. And I know he said it to my brother and sister as well, with full force. So again, it's been a privilege to learn with you all today. And I thank you for letting me share this experience with you.
Thank you, David. And Matt, thank you for the connection we had and that brought forth this. And we'll continue to post. I posted on Facebook for those of you all that are interested, the links that Matt talked about with Fathering Together and local fathering group. And so if you want to follow up on that, please do so with Matt, and let's continue to support one another and all those who father in our community. And yeah, deep bow to all three of the traditions of that we'll be experiencing. We've got actually an interfaith iftar dinner that's going to be on April 16th, and we'll have some appropriate food for our Jewish brothers and sisters that will be practicing the Seder meal as well. And it's at Second Presbyterian Church, so we're getting all of our communities there to honor one another. And you all have done so today. Thank you. And I know, when I ask people on interfaith panels, I probably should have said this before, our traditions are so diverse and in and of themselves that I'm not expecting anybody to be speaking for them, at least their experience of their tradition, but not for the tradition as a whole. So what a joy. Thank you. It's a great way to start my week, and just appreciate the camaraderie and the fathering imagery and illustration, and the way we can support each other in doing that. So for those of you that have been watching, thanks. We did not have a program next week, but we will have a couple of great programs that are coming up in April. The second week of April, we're going to be interviewing religious educators from different traditions, talking about what are the forms of religious education that each of those tradition practices. And so I hope you'll join us for that. The next week, we're going to be looking at institutions that are creating environments for thriving children. And we have a variety of panelists for that as well. And then the final week of April, we're going to have Dr. Brad Wigger, who is a professor at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. He's just come out with a book on religious imagination, specifically how kids use imaginary friends as a way of being in community with the transcendent. And so it's a really fascinating book, and I'll just have a one-on-one interview with him on religious imagination and the importance it plays in the role of children's development. So come back and join us. And again, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. May you have a blessed week and blessed holy days as those come up. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks to you all.